I can't emphasize enough how grateful I am in my life that death helped me live. Death helped me kind of really drink the juices of life, really appreciate every moment and savor every relationship, and let go of relationships that were not feeding me. Just the acceptance and knowledge that there's a limit to the quantity of life helped me embrace the quality of life. I'm not the only one. This is sort of, I think it feels like it's obvious for all of us, right? If we really meditate on the fact that this was going to end, our life is going to end, then it makes us choose things that matter most. It changes our priorities and perspectives. So I do believe that it's important for all of us as humans to really think about, when we die, how do we want to be remembered? What do we want to leave in this world? It might change decisions being made. It might change policy. It might change war, conflict.
Hello.
Rick, how are you?
Just fine, thank you.
Good.
How are you, Isabel?
I'm good. I'm good. Here we are.
Yes, indeed. Why don't we start, if you will, just tell me a little bit about your story briefly to get an idea both as to who you are and how you respond to grief.
Sure. Absolutely. When I was born, alongside my identical twin sister, we both were diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, which is a terminal genetic disease. And so we grew up in and out of the hospital and knowing that our lives would be shortened. As we grew up, we learned there was a possibility of lung transplantation as a way to extend our lives. And through all of these experiences, I lost many friends to CF. And I also met many donor families who lost loved ones suddenly and tragically and became organ donors. And so the story of grief just started to be part of my life. Declining health, losing my functioning, losing my abilities and dreams and future plans because of my illness. So grief became something that I learned to live with, struggled with, expressed, and at some point in time felt like I was able to serve others who were grieving. When I was 41, I lost my identical twin sister to cancer after 2 lung transplants. And so that kind of thrust me forward into another level of understanding and awareness about what it's like to keep living, keep focused on living, even with grief. So that's my story in a nutshell.
You were quite literally on your deathbed when you got your lung transplant. And what were you, 29 at that point?
I was 32 at the time.
32.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's hard to fully express what it's like to die and then wake up, to be born again because somebody wanted to help me, chose to give their organs to help and save other people. So my donor, Xavier, was 18 years old when he got his driver's license, and he checked the box. He wanted to be an organ donor. It blows my mind that a young man of such, he was a senior in high school, with such profound maturity of what mattered most in life for him after death was to help others. So I'm filled with love for a stranger I've never met, because he chose to save me, and not me per se, but he chose to save someone, and it happened to be me. I was critically ill. I had a very profound near-death experience. I saw the light. I saw many things, felt many things. And then I was put on a ventilator for one day when his lungs became available. So after I woke up, I wanted to, I was filled with a deep grief, a sorrow that someone had to die in order for me to live. It doesn't mean that I caused him to die. It means that somebody died, period. And because of his generosity, I could breathe and I could live.
Well, you mentioned in your growing up that, well, first of all, the back in the day, the average lifespan of a CF child was what, 10,
10,
thereabouts, 10 years
right.
old. And so as you went to a lot of CF organized events, camps, things
Yeah,
like that,
yeah,
made friends with a lot of a
yeah.
lot of people, and lost a lot of people. Is that?
Yes, right. And share my story just knowing what I feel when I talk about my story is that it is so normal. It's life. It's all I know. I don't know the other stories, the stories that you're supposed to live to 90 or 95 and die in old age. The story that I was so familiar with and what seemed so normal was that children are born sick and they're loved and they're deeply loved and cared for. And not just by parents, but by healthcare staff, nurses and doctors, respiratory therapists. And then they die. And their life, even if they were 12 or 16 or 21, it still mattered. They made a profound impact. I felt and maybe developmentally, I was at the age where peers and friends meant so much to me as a young person, but they made a profound impact on my life, and not just mine, but whoever else they touched. Yeah.
Well, in your dealing with the amount of death that you actually had to face in all of that growing up with all of your CF friends in particular, um, how is it that you came to approach grief the way you approach it? What evolved in you or took place?
I think grief is not something for me that we experience once and it somehow goes away.
Hmm.
Grief is a layer of life that I learned, it is a normal part of life. It is, blended in with the joys and the gifts and the moments that make our lives rich and fulfilling, because many of those moments, including people in those moments, end. They're over and there's the grief. And so I think for me, um, my shift towards just being grateful for these friendships, being sorrowful. I don't want to at all come across that I never grieved. I grieved and continued to grieve throughout my life for the unfairness or the tragedy of losing my best friend today, December 17, 1989. And so over time, as my grief kind of evolved and changed, I really did move from the pain and sorrow of losing her to just that sense of deep love and gratitude that she was in my life at all. So I think that's what I really recognize, that when we know that something will be taken away or will leave us, we grasp it a little bit more. And I don't mean grasp it in a desperate way, but just grasp it with awe. Like, wow, my life could have ended February 6, 2004, but instead I got 16 more years. Like, I think it is a habit of mine to both grieve and express gratitude for what I have. Many times, we call it Pollyanna, where you just focus on the positive. But I've definitely sort of balanced the need to grieve and feel the sadness and sorrow and cry and express my grief with the joys and the gratitude that I've also incorporated in my life.
So that amount of loss didn't cause you to distance yourself in relationships. You were able still, as you say, to grasp, not desperately, but grasp and appreciate the relationships you had while you had them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was 11 years old when I heard about cystic fibrosis camp. So the camp provided incredibly loving and supportive adult mentors and counselors who could hold us and kind of support us as we face mortality and talk about death as kids. So I think that was the most formative experience of my life.
Can you talk a minute? Would you talk a minute about your relationship with Ana and your
Yeah,
loss of Ana?
sure. Of course. So Anna was my identical twin. We were mirror image twins my entire life up until 41. And even beyond that was defined by being a twin. She finished my sentences. We had the same dreams. We wore the same outfits, not intentionally. So just the twin bond was kind of the closest bond anyone could have. I mean, she literally was part of me. So, and we were sisters. So we argued and fought and told each other what to do and had a normal sisterly relationship. But beyond being sisters and twins, we kept each other alive because we did chest percussion therapy. And she did it for me, and I did it for her, starting as teenagers, to take the burden away from our parents. So I call it a symbiotic relationship.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And, you know, what was it? Sorry. Um, 6 years after her transplant, she developed rejection, where the immune system attacks the lungs. And we grieve together. This party only lasts so long. And thank God she actually was eligible for another transplant. So she had another transplant and she recovered, and we wrote a book together, and we were in a film together, and then she developed cancer. So we grieved, we cried, we didn't so much protest that this was unfair. We just accepted that, gosh, there's no free lunch here. When you're given the gift of life, life means everything. It means joys, sorrows, health, adventure, but also more suffering and disease. So her death was profoundly difficult for me. But because we had been talking about death, we joked about death, we, from the age of 11, talked about which one of us would go first and how we have to have friends to ourselves so that we're prepared and have support when one of us goes. We had a very long period of what I call anticipatory grief.
Mm-hmm.
Even the first transplant, the second transplant, preparing for things not to go well, and then they did. And now it was cancer, which had no cure. There was no transplant.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a level of acceptance to say, okay, what a ride. What a ride. 41 was 4 times the amount of prognosis that she was given at birth. We were supposed to live to be 10. And I'm not saying that, you know, I do want to emphasize that my grief path was very, very difficult. I was shaky and irritable and insecure and afraid and lonely. But thankfully, I had my family, my wonderful husband, wonderful groups of friends. And then I had my job. I was a bereavement counselor before Anna died. And I often tell myself, okay, if they can do it, I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And vice versa, too. We teach each other. Yeah.
Is anticipatory grief helpful?
Absolutely. It serves to prepare us. And so, you know, if we look at it, So some people can live with a disease and have their loved ones live with the disease, even cancer, for years or decades, but none of us are exceptions to death. So I think ultimately, it is what it is. That's the acceptance. I had a terminal disease. And yeah, I think that anticipatory grief helps us come to terms with the reality that there's going to be a loss soon or someday. If we cry the tears, if we do the work of grief before the death happens, it can be helpful. It can prepare us. But if we don't, then the grief is going to be the grief after the death.
Say more about the work of grief.
The work of grief, I guess I don't want to be biased here as a grief counselor, but I think the work of grief is the emotional work, the sorrow and acknowledging and recognizing and facing the loss. And some people don't do the work of grief emotionally. Maybe they will go and fix a car. I have a neighbor who constructed a King Tut model after his mother died. So that was his way. And it could be male or female, it doesn't matter. The instrumental way of grieving is to do something with your grief, or the intuitive way is sort of to feel the feelings of grief. So, that's one danger of my work in grief counseling, is to have a bias towards emotions. But doing the work of grief is doing whatever one needs to do to accept that a loss has happened, to experience the reactions and the responses to that loss, and to become somewhat familiar enough with those responses. If they're emotional, they're emotional. If they're physical or spiritual, to experience that enough that we find some kind of peace.
There are so many ways that one lives through grief. One of the things that you had spoken about is that you don't let grief paralyze you.
Right.
And that grief can be a opportunity for a truly creative outlet.
Absolutely. Grief is fuel. It's fuel for something, fuel for creativity, fuel for athletic strength, fuel for, creating something of beauty. We have to do something with the grief, or else it feels like it's just going to sit there and eat at us or weigh us down. I think for me, I learned over the years, perhaps from my CF camp days, that it was okay to cry, and we have a specific time for memorials and to talk about sad things. And then we have arts and crafts, and we have swimming. And so being able to kind of take turns between grief and joy, and consciously and actively. So these are choices, so as to not be dominated by the sorrow and the grief, but really to take turns moving back and forth. This is kind of a well-known concept in grief counseling, to oscillate, to take turns focusing on life. And children do this automatically and naturally. It's beautiful to witness.
Well, part of that, what I hear in part of that is something that you have alluded to before, that the process of grief, first of all, is something that you have to allow to be a part of your process, and that you need to be able to develop some means of understanding what to hold on to and what to let go.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. But what I mean by that is, over the course of grief, in the beginning of the loss, of course, we would expect people to be in shock or numb, or they can't believe this has really happened, sort of denial against the reality. And then comes the sinking in of the reality. No, they really are gone, and they're gone forever. So then we experience the intense pain of grief, this deep sadness, the anger, maybe even at the doctors or at fate or God. And so over time, I think we gradually shift and move to having more of a choice over what emotions we're going to allow. So guilt and anger, those are all normal and natural parts of a death of a loved one. But over time, we have to ask ourselves, like, is this helping us move through our grief? The could've, should've, would'ves, the guilt, the wishful thinking that things were a different way. Over time, those things actually can make your grief harder. And that's what I mean by letting go of the heaviness, the thoughts that kind of make our grief harder. In your blog, you talked about pain and then suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So the death of a loved one is the pain, right? That's the reality that happens in this life. And the suffering, I should have done this. I should have taken them to the doctor. Gosh, that stupid doctor didn't, start the scan earlier or order the scan earlier. Those kinds of responses are completely natural in the beginning, but over time, they will be an excessive use of energy that can be used elsewhere. And I mentioned this is December 17th today, and so I am seeing some of my clients who were doing really well, and they were kind of re-engaging in life and finding some acceptance in the death of their loved one, and now the holidays have hit, and they kind of look like they're spiraling backwards, but they're not. This is a heightened time of more intense grief for some, especially with COVID and being sheltered inside. We can yearn and want our loved ones more than ever when they're not here. So I see that intensity of grief. And talking about the stages, I think I'm not a big believer in stages per se, but I do believe in an arc of grief, a dynamic movement across the experience of grief from the time it happens to the passage of time. And I do support and accept and do really respect Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's concept of acceptance, because acceptance is, I think, acceptance is the work of grief, moving to a place of accepting that this is my life now without my loved one. They're not coming back. Acceptance that the cancer or the accident happened, period.
Mm-hmm.
And many people really struggle with accepting those things. There's a game in their mind that they could have controlled it. And that's what I mean by the struggle, the guilt, or the counterfactual thinking, which is the could have, should have, would haves. So I think acceptance is, to me, I define acceptance as some sort of serenity in surrender.
Mm-hmm.
Accepting that we cannot control everything. Things happen, period.
I would suggest as well that forgiveness has to be a part of that as well.
Yes, thank
That
you.
in order to accept, one also has to be willing to forgive oneself.
Right.
That, as you were saying with your sister and with those that you saw, you had to acknowledge that it happened. It wasn't you. There wasn't anything you could do.
Yeah.
That's the acceptance.
Yeah. So that's why right now I do lead writing through loss groups. I really enjoy witnessing people who are grieving, being able to construct a story of what happened to them, and also document the relationship and the life that they lived with the person who died. That can be so affirming, because even for a moment, it feels like they're alive again when they're describing something joyful that they remember. And they can also document their grief path so that months or years later, they can look back and say, wow, I don't feel that way anymore. I've come a long way. And they can also document their hopes and their dreams for a future. So even in the writing, the creative process, we can help clients sort of see the arc of grief, the movement, and the hope that it will get easier someday. And they can be happy again in a different way in the future.
There's never an expectation that you're going to be cured of grief.
I like to think of it as that just like any workout that we have to do with our muscles, that holding grief is a form of a workout, and we develop stronger muscles over time. Grief doesn't get lighter, it doesn't go away. We just kind of learn to live with it. We learn to put it somewhere in our life. And maybe with our stronger muscles, it doesn't weigh as much. Yeah,
Would
feels
you
like.
would you agree that grief is an expression of love?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That love is, the sort of the greatest gift of our lives for all of us, the meaning behind our lives, our relationships. And what's left over when someone dies physically is the love, and that love will never die. So that, I think, as a grief counselor, that is the work of my job, to help people see that their grief is a form of love, and that that love will transform them, transform the person left behind, so that they can remember their loved one with love and gratitude more than with this deep aching pain.
Mm-hmm. You have talked about befriending death.
Mm-hmm.
How is that possible, especially if you're around people who are afraid of death?
What I mean by befriending death is that we're also befriending difficult emotions. We're befriending grief. We're befriending finality. And we're befriending the reality that this ends for all of us. And we cope with those emotions that we face by accepting that reality. One of the questions you had initially asked me about is permission to grieve, and that the grief is an opportunity to look inside of yourself, to get to know who you are, to develop self-awareness. And grief is also an opportunity to get out of your own way.
Oh.
So sometimes we need permission from ourselves to grieve, to cry and to mourn. And we also need to give ourselves permission to let the natural process, the sort of internal, intrinsic, biological process of grief to move through you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Isabel Allende is a famous writer
Mm-hmm.
in San Francisco, Marin,
Yeah.
and she lost her daughter. And she said, grief is like childbirth. The body knows what to do. The muscles, the sort of internal makings of a birthing uterus or birthing woman knows what to do. And likewise, I think our bodies, our spirits, our psyches know what to do with grief. Just sometimes we can get stuck in thinking, oh, I should be grieving this way, or I'm supposed to be over it. Or sometimes we get in our own way by saying, I know I did something that could have been prevented, and that's why my dad died. So that's what I mean by getting in our own way.
Mm-hmm.
We have to allow our grief to be what it is,
Mm-hmm.
to come up when it comes up, to be set aside when it can be set aside, to accept that the death unfolded the way it unfolded at no control of our own.
Mm-hmm.
And to give ourselves permission to just accept what it is, to get out of the way, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, to carry on Isabel Allende's metaphor, there's an author, chaplain, Stephen Fowler, who wrote The Art of Spiritual Midwifery. And in many respects, as a bereavement counselor, you're a midwife to grief, it seems.
Yes, I'm grateful, just like a midwife, where as a grief counselor, I'm not here to fix grief. I'm not here to make it go away or to dismiss it or get rid of it, but to walk alongside the natural process like a midwife does.
Mhm.
and provide the supports, give the towels and the the
All
things
of
that
that
midwives
stuff.
give. Yeah, the warm
Grief is
water.
messy.
Yes, exactly. Grief is messy. A lot
Yeah.
of tissues, a lot of bodily fluids, because that's how our body expresses
Mhm.
grief. But it's also, it can be beautiful because it is the path to kind of go back to your words. It is the path towards love, to really recognize, how much we loved someone is how much grief we feel for them when they
Mhm.
die. And that we have the ability to somehow harness that love and bring it forth whenever we want to, even years after they've died.
Mhm.
And to do something with the love. Some people do really dramatic things. They adopt another child, or they, become a volunteer at hospice.
Mhm.
Um, they create a beautiful work of art. There's so many things we can do with that love. But most of us, the average person, will find I consider grief a representation of the spider web that each of us lives. We
Mhm.
all have a spider web where we have multiple connections with different people in our life.
Mhm.
And when one of those connections breaks, when we have a huge hole in our spider web, I think the most common thing I see is that people find ways to strengthen the other attachments, the other connections to people in their lives. So they
Mhm.
get closer to their siblings, or they get closer to their adult children, or friends, because
Mhm.
the other person has died. So that is taking all that love that you've gathered from the person that you love and redistributing it,
Mhm.
sharing it with others.
Mhm. Mhm.
That would be my closing remark, is, grief is an opportunity to really, really find ways to look at love and share it, keep it going, pass it on.
Mhm. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rick, for inviting me to speak.